2 months after Adolf Hitler was dead, 2 months after Germany had surrendered, 2 months after the war your fathers and grandfathers fought was officially over. And then, at dawn on the 10th of July, 1945, a German submarine appeared in a harbor in Argentina. No logbook, no torpedoes, no identification papers, and a 24-year-old captain who could not or would not explain where he had been. The FBI opened a file. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. And for the next 80 years, the world would ask the same question. Was Adolf Hitler on that submarine? This is the true story of U-530. And the answer is stranger than the legend. Dawn had not yet broken over Mar del Plata that morning. The Atlantic was still black, the horizon a bruised line of gray, and the fishing boats that always went out before sunrise were slipping through the harbor mouth in single file. The men on those boats had done this crossing 1,000 times. They knew every current, every rock, every silhouette on the water. That morning, they saw something that did not belong. At first, one of the older fishermen thought it was a whale. A long dark back, glistening, half submerged, moving slowly against the tide. But whales did not have towers. Whales did not have railings. Whales did not carry the faint outline of a gun platform against the pale sky. He lowered his net. He stood up in the boat, and he stared. What he was looking at was a German submarine. 63 days after the war in Europe had ended, 12,000 kilometers from Berlin, rusting, weed-covered, its swastika insignia scraped down to a shadow on the conning tower, a ghost that should not exist. The fisherman crossed himself. Then he turned his boat around and rowed for shore, faster than he had rowed in 40 years. By the time the sun came up, the whole city would know. By the time the sun set, the whole world would. This is her story, the submarine that refused to surrender when it was ordered to, the submarine that vanished into the Atlantic after Germany had already lost the war. The submarine whose captain would defy the highest command of the German Navy and drag 54 young men through 9 weeks of darkness under the sea. It is a story of a young officer who made a choice his superiors never authorized, of 54 men who followed him into the dark, and of a legend that grew so large it swallowed the truth. But to understand what happened on that morning in Mar del Plata, we have to go back to the shipyards of Hamburg, back to a machine that was built for war. U-530 was laid down in 1942 at the Deutsche Werft yards in Hamburg. She was a Type IXC for 40 U-boat, one of the long-range designs the Kriegsmarine used to hunt far from home. 76 meters long, over 1,100 tons on the surface, 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, room for 22 torpedoes in her belly. She was built to disappear. She could travel more than 13,000 nautical miles without refueling. She could stay at sea for months. She could cross oceans. She could hide. Her first commander was Kapitan Lieutenant Kurt Lang, a methodical officer, patient, careful with his men. Under Lang, U-530 sailed on 6 war patrols across the Atlantic. She sank 2 Allied merchant ships. She damaged another. She earned her captain the Iron Cross, 2nd class. And she brought her crew home alive every single time. By late 1944, Lang had been reassigned. The war was collapsing around Germany. The Kriegsmarine was running out of experienced commanders. And the men left behind to lead the last patrols were younger, greener, less prepared for what was coming. In January of 1945, U-530 received a new captain. His name was Otto Wermuth. He was 24 years old. Wermuth had served on U-boats before. He had learned the trade, but he had never commanded one. He had never been the man in the tower, the man giving the orders, the man responsible for 54 lives crushed together inside a steel cigar under the sea. And now he was. Here is the first thing you must understand about Otto Wermuth. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a young man who had grown up inside a war machine, promoted faster than his experience should have allowed. Given a submarine at the exact moment the Reich he served was crumbling into ash. Berlin was surrounded by the Red Army. The Luftwaffe was gone. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Every day, the news from home got worse. And now, this 24-year-old lieutenant was being told to take one of the last remaining ocean-going U-boats and sail her into the Atlantic. To do what exactly? Nobody was quite sure anymore. On the 19th of February, 1945, U-530 slipped out of the Norwegian port of Kristiansand and headed west. The sea was cold and gray. The skies above were full of Allied aircraft. Wermuth kept the boat submerged for most of the transit, using her snorkel to run the diesels just below the waves, hiding from the patrol planes that would have torn her apart on the surface. Her orders were simple: cross the Atlantic, attack Allied shipping off the coast of North America, do what damage she could before whatever end was coming came. She reached the waters near Halifax by late April. There were no convoys. The routes had shifted. The war was ending, and Wermuth could feel it in the empty ocean around him. So he turned south, toward New York, toward the busy shipping lanes that had fed the American war effort for 4 years. In the first week of May, U-530 finally found targets between the 4th and the 7th of May, 1945. Wermuth ordered 9 torpedoes fired at Allied convoys off the New York coast. 9 torpedoes, every single one missed or malfunctioned, or ran deep, or failed to detonate. Not one ship was hit. Not one sailor died. Not one hull was scratched. These were the last torpedoes U-530 would ever fire in anger. The final act of her war, and they accomplished nothing at all. Wermuth would later claim that the torpedoes were defective, that the batteries had degraded, that the guidance systems had failed. And there is some truth in this. Late-war German ordnance was often unreliable. But there is also something else in the record. Something quieter. Something the young captain never spoke about openly. By the first week of May, everyone on U-530 knew the war was almost over. They had heard the radio broadcasts. They knew Berlin had fallen. They knew Hitler was dead. And it's possible, though no one can prove it, that the man aiming those torpedoes was already aiming past them. Then, on the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. At that moment, U-530 was cruising in the mid-Atlantic, roughly 1,000 miles east of Puerto Rico. The message came through on the secure U-boat frequency. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's chosen successor, the 53-year-old head of the entire Kriegsmarine, had ordered every U-boat still at sea to cease hostilities and surrender at the nearest Allied port. Dozens of submarines obeyed. They surfaced. They hoisted black flags of surrender. They sailed into ports in Britain and Canada and the United States and turned themselves over. Others followed Operation Regenbogen, the standing order to scuttle rather than be captured, and sent themselves to the bottom of the sea. For every U-boat captain still alive on the 8th of May, the choice was simple: surrender or sink your own boat. Otto Wermuth did neither. He read the order. He looked at his officers, and then he made a decision that no one had authorized him to make. A decision that would shape the next 9 weeks of his life, the next 50 years of naval legend, and the rest of his cruise careers. He decided the surrender order was a trick. He would later tell interrogators that he had not believed the message was genuine, that he suspected the Allies had broken the U-boat codes and were transmitting false orders to lure surviving submarines into ambush, that he could not verify the authenticity of the signal. Maybe he believed that, maybe he did not. Maybe a 24-year-old commander, alone in the middle of an ocean with 54 men looking at him for an answer, simply could not accept that everything he had trained for was over. Whatever the real reason, Wermuth gave the order. U-530 would not surrender to the Allies. U-530 would run. He set a course south, far south, below the equator, past the reach of Allied air patrols, past the shipping lanes, past everything. His destination was Argentina. He had chosen it, he would later say, because Argentina was neutral, because Argentina had been sympathetic to Germany throughout the war, because he believed his men would be treated better in Buenos Aires than in a British prison camp. There was only one problem with this plan. Argentina was not neutral anymore. On the 27th of March, 1945, more than 6 weeks before Wermuth made his decision, Argentina had formally declared war on Germany. It was a late move, a political calculation, a way to secure a seat at the post-war table. But it was real. Argentina was now officially an enemy state. Otto Wermuth did not know this. He was steering 54 men and a submarine full of secrets toward a country that had legally been at war with them for months. And he had no idea. The crew of U-530 rigged for silent running. They dropped below the surface. They shut down the radios. They killed all non-essential systems. For the next 9 weeks, they would disappear. No signals, no sightings, no contact with any other vessel, Axis or Allied. 54 men sealed inside a steel tube, breathing the same recycled air, eating the same dwindling rations, moving through the black water toward a country that did not know they were coming. And somewhere above them, in the daylight world, they could no longer risk entering. The war was ending. Ceremonies were being held. Photographs were being taken. Presidents were making speeches about peace. While a 24-year-old German officer in a rusting steel coffin pushed his men through the Atlantic on a voyage that no one had authorized toward a port that was no longer safe, carrying a secret that would haunt naval historians for the next 80 years. What happened in those 9 weeks? Where did U-530 go? What did she carry? What did her captain throw overboard, and why? And when she finally surfaced off Mar del Plata on that gray July morning, why did she have no logbook, no torpedoes, no identification papers, and a captain who could not or would not explain the missing time? The answers and the legend that grew from them are only just beginning. The Atlantic in May of 1945 was a graveyard. Wrecks of Allied merchantmen from 4 years of war lay scattered across the sea floor. The bones of German U-boats lay beside them. And above, on the surface, the ocean was quieter than it had been in a generation. The convoys still ran, but the wolves that had hunted them were gone, surrendered, scuttled, sunk, except for one. Somewhere south of Puerto Rico, moving at 6 knots below the waves, U-530 slipped into the emptiness and began to disappear. Otto Wermuth had made his choice. Now he had to live with it. The rules of the voyage were simple, and Wermuth enforced them without exception. During the daylight hours, the submarine stayed under. She used her snorkel, that clever German invention, a breathing tube that let her run her diesels while hiding just beneath the surface. Only her exhaust and a thin steel mast broke the water. From an aircraft a mile up, she was invisible. At night, when the sky was black and the Allied patrol planes could not see her, she rose. She ran on the surface at higher speed, charging her batteries, ventilating the boat, making the miles she needed to make before dawn drove her back down. The radio stayed silent. No transmissions, no signals, no messages home. For all the world knew, U-530 had gone to the bottom on the 8th of May with all hands. That was exactly what Wermuth wanted the world to think. Inside the boat, the men lived in a world of stale air and yellow light. A Type IXC Sea Log 40 U-boat was not built for comfort. It was built for war. The crew shared a space smaller than a modern city bus. They slept in shifts, 2 men to a bunk, one warming the mattress while the other worked. They ate cold rations when the galley could not be run. They breathed each other's sweat and diesel fumes and the sour smell of a boat that had been at sea too long. And they were young, almost impossibly young. The average sailor on U-530 was between 19 and 25 years old. Boys, most of them, who had joined the Kriegsmarine because their fathers and brothers had. Boys who now knew, in the deep pit of their stomachs, that the country they had sworn to serve no longer existed. There were no cheers when the surrender broadcast came through. There was no argument. There was only the quiet, terrible knowledge that everything they had done, every torpedo they had fired, every friend they had buried at sea had been for nothing. And then Wermuth gave the order to run. Some of the men were grateful. A neutral port meant they might live. Others were confused. Others were afraid, but no one refused. In a submarine, discipline is not a choice. It is the only thing between you and drowning. Oh, they followed him south. They passed east of Bermuda under the cover of a moonless night. They crossed the equator sometime in the middle of June in darkness so complete that the crew could not tell the sea from the sky. There was no ceremony, no shellback ritual, just the slow, grinding hum of the diesels and the pressure of the deep pressing on the hull. And then, at some point during that long southward passage, Otto Wermuth gave the order that would haunt every investigation for the next 50 years. He ordered the crew to throw everything overboard, everything that could identify them, everything that could incriminate them, everything that could incriminate them, that could be used interrogator by any court, any interrogator, any who came looking. The remaining torpedoes went first. Heavy steel fish dragged out of their tubes and dropped into the abyss. One of them had a ruptured battery. Its warhead was pulled apart and the pieces cast into the sea separately so that no single fragment could tell a story. Then the code books, every page of the Kriegsmarine's secret ciphers, every signal manual, every classified frequency chart, weighted, bagged, and gone. Then the logbook, the single most important document on any warship, the daily record of every position, every course change, every action taken. The one book that could have told the world exactly where U-530 had been, and what she had done in those missing weeks. Gone, the radar equipment, the anti-aircraft ammunition, personal papers, identification cards, photographs, overboard, all of it. By the time U-530 approached the coast of Argentina in the first week of July, she was a submarine stripped bare. She carried no weapons that could be counted, no documents that could be read, no evidence of where she had been for the past 2 months. 54 men, one submarine, and nothing else. Wermuth had originally considered surrendering at Miramar, near Buenos Aires, but the harbor was small and the political situation uncertain. He chose Mar del Plata instead, the main Argentine naval base, 300 miles south of the capital. On the night of the 9th of July, U-530 crept toward the coast on the surface, running dark, engines throttled back to a whisper. The men on watch scanned the horizon for patrol boats. They saw none. Before dawn on the 10th of July, they raised a large white flag over the conning tower. They switched on their navigation lights, the first time those lights had burned in months, and they slipped into the outer harbor of Mar del Plata. The story that later emerged, according to several accounts of the surrender, was almost absurd. U-530 was said to have slipped past a sentry who had his back turned to the sea. A German U-boat at the end of the greatest war in human history, entering a hostile port without being seen. Only when she was already inside did Wermuth signal by lamp. 2 words in Spanish: Alemán submarino, German submarine. By the time the Argentine Navy responded, U-530 was already there. 54 men climbed onto the deck with their hands empty. They were given hot food, haircuts, a change of clothes, and then they were put under armed guard and taken away. The submarine was towed to a berth and inspected. And that was when the trouble began. The Argentine officers, professional men who had spent years studying naval documents, could not believe what they were seeing. The boat had arrived stripped of everything, no functioning radar, the deck gun long since removed, and the crew carried no papers to identify themselves. When they questioned Wermuth about the missing time, he could not or would not give a straight answer. He said the voyage had taken longer than expected. He said the crew had been avoiding Allied patrols. He said he had destroyed the log to protect his men. He also lied about the engines. He told the Argentines that the diesels had failed on the way in, that the boat was mechanically crippled, that she could barely move under her own power. It was days before the truth came out. Wermuth had sabotaged the engines himself. Before entering the harbor, he had ordered acid poured into the diesel motors, ruining them beyond repair. He had wanted to make certain that no one, not the Argentines, not the Americans, not the British, could ever put U-530 back into service. When confronted with this, he admitted it without apology. And then the news reached the outside world. Within 48 hours, the story of U-530 was on every front page from Buenos Aires to New York. La Prensa ran it. Critica ran it. The New York Times ran it. And within a week, the theory that would define the legend forever had begun to spread. Adolf Hitler, the reports whispered, had not died in Berlin. He had escaped on a submarine to Argentina. An Argentine journalist claimed to have seen a police report describing a mysterious U-boat landing on the Patagonian coast unloading a high-ranking officer and a civilian woman, both in disguise. Oh. The FBI in the United States began receiving similar reports, dozens of them, from informants and cranks and frightened citizens who swore they had seen Hitler in a hotel in Bariloche, in a farmhouse near Cordoba, on a beach in the south. The world wanted to believe, and U-530 was the perfect vessel for that belief. Then, 5 weeks later, on the 17th of August, 1945, it happened again. Another German submarine appeared at Mar del Plata, U-977, commanded by another 24-year-old officer named Heinz Schäfer. She had been submerged for 66 consecutive days, a world record at the time. Her arrival at the exact same port under nearly identical circumstances blew the conspiracy theories wide open. 2 U-boats, same harbor, same excuse, same missing time. If one submarine could smuggle a fugitive to Argentina, why not 2? Why not more? Why not Hitler on one and Bormann on the other, and the Reich's gold hidden in both? The rumors grew wilder. A Brazilian admiral accused U-530 of torpedoing the cruiser Bahia on the 4th of July, 1945, a ship that had gone down under mysterious circumstances in the South Atlantic. Another Brazilian officer suggested U-530 might have come from Japan, carrying secret Axis technology. The Argentine government, embarrassed and pressured, agreed to hand the submarine and its crew over to the United States. American naval intelligence officers descended on Mar del Plata. Wermuth was interrogated for weeks. His men were separated and questioned individually. Every answer was cross-checked against every other, and every man, without exception, said the same thing. There had been no passengers, no cargo, no fugitives, no secret mission. Just 54 frightened sailors and one young captain who had refused to surrender. The physical inspection of the boat confirmed it. There were no hidden compartments, no unaccounted for storage. Nothing that could have concealed a man, let alone a dictator. But then, in late July, the Brazilian Navy released the findings of its own investigation into the sinking of the Bahia. The cruiser had not been torpedoed at all. She had been destroyed by an accidental explosion during an anti-aircraft gunnery drill. Ammunition on deck had caught fire. The magazine had gone up. No submarine had been anywhere near her. The accusation against U-530 collapsed, but the deeper question remained. If Wermuth had not been carrying Hitler, and had not sunk the Bahia, and had not brought Nazi gold to Argentina, then what had he been doing for those 9 silent weeks under the Atlantic? And why had he thrown everything overboard before coming in? The truth about Otto Wermuth, when it finally emerged, was smaller than the legend, and in some ways sadder. By the autumn of 1945, American interrogators, first in Mar del Plata and then in Washington, had built a complete picture of what U-530 had done during those missing weeks. They had cross-examined every man in the crew. They had studied every scratch on the hull. They had compared Wermuth's statements to the statements of his officers, and the statements of his officers to the statements of his enlisted men. And the picture that emerged was this: a 24-year-old submarine commander on his first independent command had received an order he did not want to obey. He had convinced himself the order might be false. He had He had spent more than 2 months hiding under the ocean because he was afraid of what would happen if he came up. And when he finally did come up, he threw away every piece of evidence that could prove he had disobeyed a direct order from the head of the German Navy. That was all. No Hitler, no Eva Braun, no gold, no secret cargo, no mission from Berlin. Just a frightened young man in over his head, making one bad decision after another, and dragging 54 sailors along with him. The Allied investigation into Hitler's death, meanwhile, had reached its own conclusion. Every credible source, every witness from the Führer bunker, every forensic examination the Soviets would eventually share pointed to the same fact. Adolf Hitler had died in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945. He had shot himself. Eva Braun had taken cyanide beside him. Their bodies had been burned in the Chancellery garden. He had never been on a submarine. He had never been in Argentina. He had never left the ruins of the city he had destroyed. But the legend did not die. In 1952, 7 years after his surrender at Mar del Plata, Heinz Schäfer, the commander of U-977, published a memoir. He called it U-Boot 9 and 77. He wrote it in part to defend himself and in part to defend his old friend Otto Wermuth. He wanted to end the rumors once and for all. He wanted to tell the world that neither submarine had carried Hitler, that the missing weeks had a simple explanation, that the whole thing had been the desperate act of 2 young officers who did not want to be prisoners of the British. The book was a bestseller, and it did the opposite of what Schäfer intended. By writing an entire book denying the Hitler story, Schäfer gave the story new life. Every reader who picked up U-Boot 977 came away thinking that something must have happened. Or why would a man write 400 pages to deny it? The very act of defense became evidence in the minds of conspiracy theorists, of guilt. The legend grew. It grew through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It grew as documentaries were made. It grew as novels borrowed from it. It grew as tabloids reprinted it every few years with a new twist. It is still growing today, on television, in books, on the internet, wherever people would rather believe a lie that is exciting than a truth that is small. The men who had actually been on U-530 lived out quieter lives. The crew were held in the United States until 1946 and 1947, then repatriated to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. None of them were charged with war crimes. Their only offense had been failing to surrender on time. And by 1947, no one wanted to prosecute that. Otto Wermuth went home. He lived into old age. He gave a few interviews over the years. He always insisted he had done nothing dishonorable. He always insisted he had only wanted to protect his men. He was not a Nazi, he said. He was a sailor. He had done what sailors do. He had brought his crew home alive. And in that, at least, he was telling the truth. Not a single man of U-530 died on that voyage. 54 sailors went into the Atlantic on the 8th of May. 54 sailors came out on the 10th of July in a war that had killed 30,000 German submariners. That was no small thing. The submarine herself had a less dignified end. After the American interrogations were complete, the United States Navy took possession of U-530 as a war prize. In the autumn of 1945, she was towed north through the Panama Canal and up to the east coast of the United States. She was briefly put on public display, a captured trophy of the war just ended, so that American citizens could walk past her rusting hull and see with their own eyes that the enemy had been real. Then, on the 20th of November, 1947, the United States Navy decided she had served her purpose. Off the coast of Cape Cod, on a cold, gray Atlantic morning that must have looked a great deal like the morning she had first slipped out of Christiansand, an American submarine named USS Toro rose to periscope depth. Her captain lined up his target. He gave the order to fire. Live torpedoes left the tubes. They struck U-530 amidships. The hull split. The sea rushed in. And the submarine that had crossed an ocean to escape the end of the war, that had defied direct orders from the highest command of the Kriegsmarine, that had spawned one of the great naval legends of the 20th century, sank quickly to the bottom. She lies there still, on the floor of the North Atlantic, off the coast of Massachusetts. 2 pieces of rusting steel. A young captain's bad decision, buried under 1,000 feet of cold water. But this story does not end with U-530. Because while Otto Wermuth did not carry any Nazis to South America, other men, worse men, did make that journey. Not in submarines, not in dramatic secret voyages under the sea, but on airplanes and on ships with Red Cross papers, and through a network of Vatican priests and Argentine officials that historians would later call the rat lines. Adolf Eichmann, the man who had managed the logistics of the Holocaust, arrived in Argentina in 1950. He lived in a suburb of Buenos Aires under a false name for a decade before Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960 and put him on trial in Jerusalem. Josef Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz, arrived in 1949. He lived in Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil, and died there of a stroke in 1979, having never faced justice. Erich Priebke responsible for a massacre in Rome, arrived in 1948 and was not extradited to Italy until the 1990s. Klaus Barbie, Walter Kutschmann, dozens of others. They came by the hundreds, and they were sheltered quietly by an Argentine government under Juan Perón that had decided the enemies of its enemies were welcome. None of them came on U-530, but the suspicion that fell on U-530 in July of 1945, the panic that gripped the front pages, the sense that something was deeply wrong about that submarine's arrival, turned out to be a warning that was correct about the phenomenon, if not about the vessel. Nazi war criminals were coming to Argentina. They were being welcomed. They were being hidden. It just was not happening the way anyone imagined. Otto Wermuth had not brought Hitler to Patagonia, but history had brought worse men by quieter routes, and history had let them stay. That is the real ending of the U-530 story. Not a dictator on a submarine, not gold in a Patagonian cave, not a secret Nazi base in Antarctica. Just a young officer who panicked, a crew that followed him, and a legend that grew so loud it drowned out the sound of the real crimes happening in plain sight. 80 years later, U-530 lies broken on the sea floor. Otto Wermuth is dead. Heinz Schäfer is dead. Almost every man who was aboard that submarine in July of 1945 is gone now. The Argentine officers who accepted the surrender are dead. The American interrogators are dead. The witnesses, the reporters, the conspiracy theorists of that first summer, all gone. But the story remains. It remains because it sits at the exact place where fear meets history, where a real event, strange enough on its own, gets pulled into orbit around a bigger question that humanity cannot let go of. How did it end? Did any of them get away? The answer in the case of U-530 is no. No one got away on that submarine. No dictator escaped. No treasure was smuggled. No secret was carried. But in the case of the wider question, the honest answer is harder. Some of them did get away. Not on a U-boat. Not in the dark, under the ocean, but on daylight flights and passenger ships with forged papers and friendly stamps into a country that asked no questions. U-530 was not the escape route. She was just the story that made the world start looking.